There's something about the quiet hours of the night that unsettles even the most hardened security guard. You're left alone, with nothing but the sound of your own footsteps and the endless ticking of the clock to remind you of how slowly time passes. I've worked as a night security guard for most of my adult life, and I've seen and heard things I couldn't explain. But nothing compared to the nightmare I lived through at the cold water processing plant. The plant was a sprawling industrial complex on the outskirts of a forgotten town. It had once been a bustling factory, churning out steel parts for machinery. But by the time I got there, it was a shadow of its former self. Most of the buildings were abandoned, their windows shattered, and the whole place had the feel of something left behind by time. Still, it paid well, and I was in no position to turn down a steady paycheck. My job was simple: patrol the grounds, check the locked doors, and make sure no one was sneaking onto the property after dark. There had been some trouble with kids breaking in and tagging the walls with graffiti, and the company wanted to keep it from happening again. It seemed like an easy gig. The first few nights passed without incident, just me and my flashlight, walking through the empty corridors and across the deserted parking lots. The only sounds were the hum of the wind through broken windows and the occasional clatter of something falling in the distance, probably a rat or stray cat. Then things started to change. It began one night around 2 a.m. I was making my rounds, shining my flashlight into the dimly lit hallways of the main building when I heard it, a low, mechanical hum, like the sound of old machinery grinding to life. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own footsteps, but it grew louder the closer I got to the heart of the building. The thing is, there wasn't supposed to be any machinery running. The plant had shut down years ago, and the only active section was the front office, where I checked in at the beginning and end of each shift. So, where was the noise coming from? Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the sound deeper into the building, down a set of stairs that led to the lower levels. The air grew colder as I descended, and the hum grew louder, reverberating off the concrete walls. I found myself standing in front of a massive set of metal doors. They were rusted, worn from years of disuse, but the hum was definitely coming from behind them. My first thought was that maybe someone had broken in and was messing around with the old equipment. I grabbed the handle, expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, the door creaked open with a groan. Inside was a massive room, filled with old, decrepit machines, hulking giants of steel and iron that hadn't been used in decades. But in the center of the room, one of the machines was running. I froze. This wasn't possible. There was no power to this part of the plant. I had checked the breakers myself on my first night, and they were all switched off. So how was this thing running? I took a step closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim light, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like a heavy fog. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The machine wasn't connected to anything. No wires, no pipes, nothing. It was just standing there, running on its own. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but as I did, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound echoed through the room, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I rushed to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was locked in. My heart pounded in my chest as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but I knew no one was coming. I was the only one there. The plant was deserted, and even if someone was nearby, they wouldn't hear me from this far down. As I stood there, breathing heavily, the humming grew louder, more intense, and suddenly, the machine stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. Then, slowly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer. I backed up against the door, my hands shaking as I swept the room with the beam of light. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the far side of the room, a shadow emerged from behind one of the machines. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form was vaguely human, but distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. It stood there, unmoving, its eyes, or at least where I imagined its eyes would be, locked on me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. Without thinking, I hurled my flashlight at the door, hoping to break the glass window that was set in the top half. The light shattered on impact, and the bulb flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, I heard the footsteps again, rapid, heavy, and they were coming straight for me. I fumbled for the handle, yanking on it with all my strength. It gave way just as the thing reached me, and I threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I called my supervisor that night and quit on the spot. I didn't give an explanation, didn't tell him what had happened. I just left. A week later, I heard that the cold water plant had been condemned. They were tearing it down, piece by piece, leveling it to the ground. Part of me was relieved, but the other part of me wondered what they might find in the rubble. I still don't know what that thing was, or how the machine had come to life. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I hope I never will again. Working the night shift as a security guard is not for everyone. The long hours, the isolation, and the ever-present sense of something being wrong make it a job most people avoid. But the pay was good, and I needed the money. When I got assigned to the Lakeview shopping complex, I figured it would be an easy gig, just a bunch of empty stores and a parking lot to patrol. Little did I know, that night would change everything for me. The complex itself was massive, spread over several acres, with rows of shops, food courts, and a cinema that had been abandoned for years. It had been one of those shopping centers that boomed in the 90s, but as time went on, business dried up, and the owners let the place fall into disrepair. Only a few shops were still in operation, and they closed early, leaving me to walk through the deserted hallways for hours. From the moment I started, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't unusual to feel uneasy during a night shift, especially in such a large, empty space, but this was different. The sensation was more intense, like there were eyes on me every time I turned a corner or walked past a darkened storefront. The first week passed without incident, but on my 6th night, things started getting strange. I was doing my usual rounds, walking down the main corridor of the complex, when I noticed something odd. One of the lights in the food court area was flickering. It wasn't the typical fluorescent light flicker you get in old buildings. It was rhythmic, like someone was controlling it. As I approached, the flickering stopped, and the light went out completely. I shone my flashlight toward the area, expecting to see nothing but empty tables and chairs. Instead, I saw a figure standing near the counter of an abandoned coffee shop. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like a long, dark coat, but the shadows made it hard to make out any details. I called out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." My voice echoed through the empty hall. The figure didn't move. I took a few cautious steps forward, my flashlight aimed directly at the figure, but before I could get any closer, it vanished. Not like someone ducking behind a counter or running away, it was just gone, like it had never been there. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe I was just tired, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The rest of the night passed in eerie silence. I tried to shake off the encounter, but I couldn't. Every time I passed by the food court, I half expected to see the figure again. The next few nights were uneventful, and I started convincing myself that it had all been in my head. But then, on the 10th night, things escalated. It was around 3 a.m., the deadest part of the night, when I heard a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the cinema. The cinema had been closed for years, its entrance boarded up, but the whispering was clear, like someone was standing just beyond the barricade, talking to themselves. I hesitated for a moment before heading toward the sound. The closer I got, the louder the whispering became, though I still couldn't make out any words. When I reached the entrance, I shone my flashlight over the boards. The whispering stopped. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. Then, from behind the boards, I heard a sharp knock, like someone was tapping on the wood from the other side. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone wanted me to come closer. Instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. Something about the sound was hypnotic, drawing me in, compelling me to stay. I found myself stepping closer, reaching out to touch the boards. As my hand brushed the surface, the knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, a loud crash came from inside the cinema, like something heavy had fallen. I jumped back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My heart raced as I backed away, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was inside. Just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the hall, and there it was again, the figure from the food court. This time, it was closer, standing at the far end of the corridor, motionless, watching me. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No response. The figure stood still, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty mall as I made my way back to the security office. Once inside, I locked the door and sat down, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I saw a shadowy figure and heard whispers behind boarded-up doors. They'd think I was crazy. I spent the rest of the night in the office, too afraid to go back out on patrol. The figure didn't appear again, but I could feel its presence, lingering just outside, waiting for me to make a move. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I didn't give a reason, just told my boss that I couldn't work there anymore. He didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to quit after the night shift," he said, almost casually. That was years ago, and I've never gone back to Lakeview Shopping Complex. I've tried to forget what happened, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But every now and then, I'll hear a whisper in a quiet room, or catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, and I'm reminded of that night. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. If I had walked into the cinema, opened the door to whatever was knocking. But I know I'll never find out, and I'm okay with that. Some things are better left unseen. I took the night security job at the West Side warehouse to get away from the noise of city life. The warehouse was massive, sitting on the outskirts of town, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was an old building, used primarily for storing equipment and supplies for construction companies. My job was simple: make sure no one broke in, and check that everything was secure. Easy money, or so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd walk the perimeter, shine my flashlight down the endless rows of crates and machines, then sit in the security booth and watch the camera feeds. Nothing ever happened. In fact, it was so quiet out there that I started to get bored. I'd bring books to read or listen to music through my headphones just to pass the time. But things started to change on my fifth night. It was around 2 a.m., and I was making my usual rounds. The air was cold and crisp, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. As I passed by one of the large loading docks, I noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from one of the windows on the second floor. Now, I'd been through this building enough times to know that the upper floors were mostly empty offices, long abandoned by the previous owners. There shouldn't have been any lights on up there, especially not at this time of night. Curious, I decided to check it out. I climbed the metal staircase leading to the second floor, each step creaking under my weight. The hallway was dark, save for the pale glow coming from an office at the far end. I gripped my flashlight tightly and made my way down the hall. As I got closer to the door, the light suddenly flickered and went out. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered turning back, but something about the situation drew me forward. I reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The room was pitch black, but I could feel the cold air pressing down on me, colder than the rest of the building. I shone my flashlight around the room, nothing out of the ordinary. Just an old desk, some filing cabinets, and a few broken chairs. But then, I noticed something strange. In the corner of the room, there was a pile of papers scattered on the floor. They were old, yellowed with age, but they were arranged in a neat circle. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but as I looked closer, I realized that the papers formed a shape like a symbol, or a sigil. I bent down to get a better look when I heard it. I stood up quickly and spun around, shining my flashlight into the dark hallway. Nothing. The whispering stopped as soon as I turned, but the feeling of being watched remained. My skin crawled, and I could feel my heart racing. I backed out of the room slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the hallway, and made my way back down the stairs. Once I was back on the main floor, I felt a little safer, but that unease lingered. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about that room, about the papers and the whispers. Something wasn't right about that place. The next night, I decided to check the security cameras, hoping to find some sort of explanation for the light in the office. I sat in the booth, staring at the monitors, fast-forwarding through the footage from the previous night, and then I saw it. At around 1:45 a.m., the camera in the second-floor hallway picked up movement. A shadowy figure appeared at the far end of the hall, just outside the office where I had found the papers. The figure moved slowly, almost gliding, and disappeared into the room. I rewound the footage, watching it again and again, trying to make sense of it. The figure wasn't clear enough to make out any details, but it was definitely there. I wasn't alone in that building. That night, I avoided the second floor entirely, sticking to my usual patrol of the main level. But as the hours passed, I began to hear strange noises, footsteps, soft thumps, and that same faint whispering, always just out of earshot. At one point, as I was walking past the loading docks, I heard a loud crash behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the area, but there was nothing there. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the fear creeping up on me. I knew I had to get out of there. I hurried back to the security booth and locked the door, sitting down in front of the monitors. For the rest of the night, I kept my eyes glued to the screens, watching for any sign of movement. At around 3 a.m., the cameras picked up something again. The figure was back, standing at the top of the metal staircase, looking down toward the main floor. It was just standing there, completely still. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't see any features, just a dark silhouette, and moving, watching. Suddenly, the figure began to descend the stairs, one slow step at a time. I watched, frozen, as it made its way down to the ground level. But just as it reached the bottom step, the camera feed flickered and went black. Panic surged through me. I tried to switch to another camera, but all of them were down. The entire system had crashed. I was on my own. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted for the exit, not caring about my patrol or the job anymore. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. As I reached the front doors, I stopped in my tracks. The figure was standing just outside the glass, inches from me, its face pressed against the door. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, and sure of what to do. Then, in a blink, it was gone. I didn't waste any time. I threw open the door and ran to my car, not looking back. I drove away as fast as I could, my heart racing, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I never went back to the warehouse after that. I quit the job the next day, telling my boss that I couldn't handle the night shift anymore. He didn't ask questions, he just nodded, like he had heard it all before. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that warehouse, but I know one thing for sure. There's something in that building, something that doesn't want to be disturbed, and I'll never set foot in there again. I never imagined that a simple night security job would turn my life upside down. It was a routine gig. Watch over the factory after hours, make sure no one broke in, and report any unusual activity. The factory was old, one of those sprawling complexes from the early 1900s that had seen better days. It had been shut down for years before a new company bought it, planning to renovate and reopen it in the coming months. Until then, they needed someone to watch over the place, and I needed the money. The first few weeks were easy enough. The factory sat on the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods on one side and an old highway on the other. My patrols were pretty straightforward: walk around the perimeter, check the entrances, and occasionally walk through the vast, Empty interior. It was cold inside, the kind of bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep through the walls. But it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. That was, until the third week. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. I would hear faint sounds as I walked through the factory. A creak here, a soft thud there. I chalked it up to the age of the building after all. Old buildings make noise, right? But then, the sounds grew louder. I started hearing footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing from somewhere in the factory, but always when I was alone. One night, I was making my usual round through the production floor when I heard them again, footsteps, distinct and clear, coming from above. The factory had a second floor, mostly consisting of old offices and storage rooms, but no one was supposed to be up there. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was just the wind, or the building settling. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the floor to the other. I knew I had to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and started up the metal stairs, each step echoing through the building. As I reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. I stood there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The second floor was dark, with only the faint light from my flashlight illuminating the way. I slowly walked down the hall, checking each door as I passed. Every room was empty, just as they had been before, but something felt off. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence. I decided to check the last room at the end of the hall. It was the largest office, once used by the factory manager, with a huge window overlooking the production floor below. As I reached for the door, I heard it again, the footsteps, this time right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the hall, but there was nothing there. My skin crawled as I realized that whoever or whatever was making those sounds was playing with me. I backed away from the door, my pulse quickening. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my flashlight casting strange shapes on the walls, but these shadows were different. They moved, shifting and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. They weren't coming from me or the light. They seemed to be moving of their own accord. I stood there, frozen, watching as the shadows danced along the walls, growing darker and larger, creeping toward me. Panic surged through me. I backed away, but the shadows followed, closing in from all sides. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. I was plunged into complete darkness. My flashlight sputtered, the beam flickering weakly before dying completely. I was left standing in the pitch black, surrounded by the suffocating shadows. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking. "This is Andrews. I need backup at the factory. Now." Static crackled over the radio, but no response came. I was on my own. I turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway, back toward the stairs. The shadows seemed to follow me, growing darker and more solid with every step I took. I could feel them closing in, like a heavy blanket of darkness pressing down on me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stumbled, falling to my knees. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the security booth. Slamming the door shut behind me, I locked the door and collapsed into the chair, breathing heavily. My hands were trembling, and I could still feel the cold grip of fear around my chest. For the rest of the night, I sat in that booth, watching the security monitors, waiting for anything to show up. But the cameras remained clear. There was no sign of the shadows, no footsteps, nothing. It was as if the building had returned to its normal, lifeless state. But I knew better. The next night, I was reluctant to return to the factory, but I needed the job. I convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had let the dark and the isolation get to me. I went back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting for me in that building. Sure enough, as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it again, that heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that wraps around you and squeezes, making it hard to breathe. I decided to avoid the second floor altogether. Instead, I focused on the ground level, checking the entrances and the perimeter. But the feeling of unease never left me. As the night wore on, the shadows returned. They started small at first, just flickers in the corners of my vision. But as the hours passed, they grew bolder, moving across the walls and floors, always just out of reach. I could feel them watching me, stalking me, waiting for the right moment. Around 3 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty building. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my patrol, but they followed me wherever I went. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran back to the security booth, locked the door, and turned on all the lights. I sat there, trembling, watching the monitors. That's when I saw it. On one of the cameras, in the far corner of the production floor, a figure stood. It was tall and dark, its features obscured by shadow, but I could see its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, watching me through the camera. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, staring back at me. Suddenly, the camera feed cut out. The screen went black, and the room was plunged into darkness once again. I grabbed my flashlight and ran for the exit, not caring about the job anymore. I just needed to get out. As I reached the door, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze, fear paralyzing me. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see the shadowy figure standing behind me. But there was nothing there, just the empty factory, bathed in darkness. I bolted for my car and sped away, never looking back. I quit the job the next day. I didn't bother explaining why, I just told them I couldn't do it anymore. The factory remains abandoned, and to this day, I don't know what I encountered in that building. But I'll never forget the feeling of those shadows, creeping closer and closer, until they were all around me. Taking the job as a night security guard at the old Greystone Mall felt like hitting the jackpot. The pay was higher than I expected for a job that just required me to walk around and make sure no one was breaking in. The mall had been closed for nearly a decade, left to decay after the last tenants moved out, leaving behind a skeleton of what used to be the heart of the town. It was once a bustling center of activity, with families shopping, kids running through the food court, and teenagers hanging out by the fountains. But now, it was just a vast, echoing emptiness. The place had an eerie reputation. People whispered about how it was haunted by the ghosts of former employees who had died in a fire decades earlier. But I didn't buy into that kind of talk. I didn't believe in ghosts or haunted malls. I believed in making rent. My first shift was uneventful. I walked the dark halls with my flashlight in hand, my boots echoing off the cracked tile floors. Most of the stores were boarded up or locked tight, their windows covered in dust. The few that weren't had been cleared out long ago, leaving only broken mannequins and scattered garbage behind. The food court, once bustling with the smell of greasy fries and pizza, was now a cold, hollow space. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the faint smell of mildew clung to everything. The second night was when things started to get weird. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the sound of glass shattering. My heart jumped in my chest. I pulled out my flashlight and followed the noise, heading toward the west wing of the mall where the department stores had been. The air felt colder as I approached, and the beams from my flashlight seemed to barely cut through the darkness. When I reached the source of the noise, I found a shattered window, but no sign of what had caused it. There was no rock, no object, just shards of glass scattered on the floor. I radioed the office, letting them know I'd found some broken glass but didn't see any intruders. They told me to clean it up and keep an eye out. No big deal, right? Just some kids messing around. But that nagging feeling of unease followed me for the rest of the night. By the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The mall was darker than usual, and the power had been flickering on and off. I was patrolling near the old movie theater, which sat in a forgotten corner of the mall. The entrance was blocked off, but I could still see the faded posters and the rusted ticket booth inside. That's when I saw the flickering light of the projector room. The theater had been closed for years, and there was no way anyone could have gotten in there. But the light was unmistakable, flickering against the back of the screen, casting strange, shifting shadows through the boarded-up entrance. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay away, but curiosity got the better of me. I made my way through the empty corridor, my flashlight barely illuminating the way ahead. The closer I got, the colder the air became. I reached the entrance to the theater, pressed against the boarded-up doors, and peered through a crack between the wooden planks. Inside, the theater was dark, but the projector room was glowing. The flickering light was casting strange shadows across the broken seats. The smell of burnt popcorn hung in the air, despite the fact that nothing had been served there in years. But what made my blood run cold was the figure standing in front of the screen. It was tall, hunched over, its silhouette warped and wrong. At first, I thought it was just another mannequin, maybe one of those old movie display props. But then it moved, slowly, jerkily, like it was struggling to stand. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach as the figure turned its head, almost as if it sensed me watching. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away from the door, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was no way anyone could have gotten in there. The theater had been locked up for years, and I had the only set of keys for the building. I radioed in again, my voice shaking. "This is Marshall. I'm seeing movement in the old theater. I'm going to investigate." The response came back, static heavy, but clear enough. "Copy that, Marshall. Be careful." I wish they could have heard the fear in my voice. I took a deep breath, unhooked the key to the theater from my belt, and unlocked the door. It creaked open, and I stepped inside, flashlight aimed at the floor. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of decay, and the temperature had dropped significantly. Every step echoed, and I could hear the rustle of old candy wrappers underfoot. The projector light flickered above me, but the figure was gone. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the rows of seats, half expecting to see the hunched figure looming in the shadows. But the theater was empty, desolate, as it had been for years. My heart raced as I approached the projector room. The door was slightly ajar, and the flickering light was spilling out into the hallway. I pushed the door open. The projector was running, the old film reels spinning, casting a grainy black and white image onto the torn screen. But there was no one there. No one had been there for a long time. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like curtains. I approached the projector, my breath visible in the freezing air. I reached out to stop the film, my hand trembling. As soon as I touched it, the film stopped abruptly, and the room plunged into darkness. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there, coming from somewhere deep in the theater. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. My chest tightened as I turned, my flashlight flickering back to life. The figure was there, standing in the aisle, its face hidden in shadow. It stood still, watching me, and I could feel its eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The fear was paralyzing. Suddenly, the figure began to move, slowly advancing toward me. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it was struggling to stay upright. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the projector. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the theater, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. I turned and ran, bolting out of the projector room and down the aisle. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more frantic with every step I took. I could feel the figure's presence right behind me, like a shadow clinging to my back. When I finally burst through the doors of the theater, I slammed them shut and locked them behind me. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I ran back to the security office, barely able to think straight. Once inside, I locked the door and collapsed into the chair, staring at the monitors. But the cameras were static, every single one of them. The flickering light from the projector room was gone. The theater was dark again, and there was no sign of the figure. But the whispering, it didn't stop. It lingered in my ears, soft but persistent, even though I was miles away from the theater. I quit the next morning. I never went back to that mall. I don't know what I saw that night, or what the figure was, but I knew one thing for sure: I was never stepping foot in that place again.